Good afternoon, my name is Maciej Świderski. I'm a journalist and urban activist, but most importantly, I'm a former student of this great American Studies Center. And first of all, I would like to thank Professor Bogdan Szklarski for letting me organize this event. And second of all, I would like to welcome you to this first lecture of the short series of lectures on American Modernist Architecture and urban planning. And today's lecture will be an introductory one. It will be divided into two parts. In the second one, I will talk about the origins of modernism in America. And in the first part, Mr. Grzegorz Piątek will concentrate on the European origins of this style. So first, let me introduce him. He is an architecture critic, architecture historian, and co-founder of Centrum Architektury Foundation. His main field of research is the 20th century architecture in Poland and Europe. He currently works on a PhD thesis on the image of Warsaw in pre-war architecture exhibitions and has just finished writing a biography of Mayor Stefan Starzyński. He also edited the first Polish editions of classical architecture writings of Le Corbusier and Jane Jacobs. And without further ado, please welcome Grzegorz Piątek.
Thank you. Thank you, Maciej, for inviting me to speak on this glorious afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Maciej gave me a very difficult task of giving you an introduction into modernist architecture in general, to explain you how this all came about, and you know very well that it's in every field of research it's very difficult to generalize, to make generalizations. And the more you get into details, the more you see that these generalizations don't work anymore, and they're very easily challenged. But I'll do my best to give you the basics and not to be too general and too too general about it. So first of all, it's important to realize that the modernist architecture and the modernist idea of the city and the modernist idea of building came up in different places at roughly the same time, because it has to do with certain phenomena that were occurring all over the world in 19th century at different, of course, at different pace. But generally speaking, 19th century was the century of acceleration of just about everything, of the technical progress, of the scientific discoveries, or the population growth. The first mega cities, as they are now called, grew in 19th century. First of them was London, and the modern means of transportation. Started to make the world smaller and smaller. One.
Tutaj jest coś bardzo słabo. Coś jakby z głosem.
Raz, dwa, trzy. Czy ten jest lepszy? Ale jest ok? Słychać mnie?
Tak, dobrze.
Ale nothing happened. Okay, can I carry on? Sure. Okay. And you can see this acceleration on this graph behind me. You can see very clearly that the world population started to grow very fast sometime around the 18th century, and it kept on growing, and
that's a comic relief section.
Yeah, is it better? Yeah, it's much louder. And this phenomena called for a new type of, for a new way. This is too loud. At least for me.
Tutaj mam pokrętło takie srebrne.
Dobrze. W lewo? Dobra. And these new ways of living, these new ways of communicating between people, the new economies and the new cities started to call for new types of buildings, new type of cities. It all started in England, which was the first. England was the first fully industrialized and urbanized nation in the world, and one of those places where the new developments in engineering took place very early. And you can see that this. I'm showing here one of the first wonders of modern engineering, the first bridge. Built without any brick, with the main bearing structure built without any brick or wood. This is the so-called Iron Bridge in England, built in 18th century. And these engineering structures were among the first that pointed into a new direction in architecture. And they made the best use of the new building technologies and the new engineering possibilities, while the so-called, let's say, proper architecture was lagging behind. And architects had a very big problem with this question of decorum. Decorum it has nothing to do with decoration. Decorum is the appropriate form of a building, one that is in harmony with its function, with the technology, and so on. So as you can see here in these water towers, these quite magnificent, magnificent engineering structures, architects had a problem into translating these new possibilities into a different architectural form, and were using the historic forms that had nothing to do with the technology inside them to decorate these structures. On the left-hand side, you see a water tower in America, built in a Greek Revival style, and on the right-hand side, a water tower in Wrocław, then Breslau, modeled after a medieval castle. So architects and thinkers saw a growing divide between the technology that is being actually used to construct the environment around them and the new buildings and the new structures, and the historic forms that were still de rigueur in architecture, and which were required at architecture schools that architects were trained to use. And these historical styles were challenged more and more by the new typologies, new types of buildings that were not that had no had no let's say that had no early forms or earlier forms that architecture could refer to. So first of all, we have the train stations. The train was one of these devices that made the world, that kept on making the world smaller and smaller. And the train stations were buildings that had no, let's say, precedent in architecture history. They were often modeled on after cathedrals or market halls, medieval market halls. But this gap between the function and the technology and the style was growing more and more apparent. Same goes for modern civic buildings. Of course, there were public buildings before, but the modern cities and nation states created new typologies for public libraries, public museums, courthouses, post offices. These typologies did not really exist before 19th century. And same goes for housing. The question of mass housing started to became in fact the central problem for architecture and for urban planning. By the beginning of 20th century, these growing megacities called for new forms of housing that that also had no, that history was not, could not help in creating, developing. And then you have the modern office building as well, which led to the development of the modern skyscraper. So all these new typologies had no ready form, no recipe. The breakthrough came in mid-19th century, and it was not recognized as a real breakthrough in the beginning. As it is often the case, the great discoveries and the great breakthroughs are only recognized after a certain amount of time, from a certain perspective. And this building that is now often being cited as the breakthrough, that has a lot of features that modern architecture came to embody, was the Crystal Palace in London, an exhibition pavilion created for the World Exhibition in London in 1851, and one of the one of the very telling thing about this revolutionary building was that it was not even designed by an architect. It was designed by a gardener, Joseph Paxton, who had an experience in building glass houses and conservatories in British residences and British gardens, and he came up, perhaps it's because perhaps the reason why he was so daring in his thinking was that he had no training, he had no inhibitions and limitations that were trained architects were trained to have in architecture schools. So he was thinking in purely practical, functional ways, without the burden of tradition and without these limitations. The exhibition, the World Exhibition itself, the first World Exhibition, was in itself a very modernist event, because it was an embodiment of this very modern idea of cataloging the world, the cataloging everything, like the encyclopedia, or like the science museum, or like an archive. So about putting the world into categories and then putting it on display. The exhibition was a huge success, and so was the building. But its meaning for history of architecture was not so obvious at first. And here I would like to show you the main features of these buildings that proved to be so revolutionary. So first of them was the open plan. This became one of the main problems of architecture in the coming decades and in the next 100 years. The architecture was about opening up the space inside, and it all became possible thanks to steel structures and then reinforced concrete structures thanks to frames, columns, and this potential of architecture to open up the interior, to open up the space, was never realized on such a grand scale before the Crystal Palace. It was used in factories for purely practical reasons, as in also in this case. But starting with the Crystal Palace, it became more and more important for creating public buildings and prestigious buildings, not just factories or warehouses. And this led us to the modern office, to the modern open plan office. In this picture you can see actually an American building, and one of the most sophisticated examples of an open plan office, the S.C. Johnson headquarters, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. But it takes us all the way to our times and to this much criticized open plan office. The Crystal Palace was also the first important building in the world, probably, where the wall became what used to be the external wall became the skin of the building. that has no bearing, that is not a load-bearing wall, but rather a curtain, something very light, something very transparent, and the facade became independent of the bearing structure. And it also is something that can be traced throughout modern architecture and all the way to our times. And the main, one of its main features is the curtain wall. You know, the glass and steel wall that doesn't have any bearing, that doesn't bear any load, and it's just a thin curtain that divides the exterior from the interior. Transparency is one of the main features of modern architecture, and one of the main problems of modern architecture. Here you can see a tree, an actual tree growing inside the Crystal Palace, and I love these pictures because it shows the potential of this curtain wall, of the glass facade, of blurring the line between the inside and the outside. And it's also another feature that can be traced throughout modern architecture, as in the case of this American building, Philip Johnson's, the own house in Connecticut, the so-called glass house. There's another little house, a little cottage on this site, actually for guests, and it's built of brick. Without, it's much more intimate, but the actual house is a glass display box. And the Crystal Palace was also, one of the wonderful features of Paxton's building was that this building was easy to assemble because it was built out of prefabricated elements. And it was as easy to disassemble and to be reassembled at another site. And 3 years after the opening of the Great Exhibition, it was actually reopened on the other end of London, and it survived until the 30s when it burned down. But it functioned successfully for the next decades on a new site, serving as an exhibition venue. A venue for major public events, and actually there's still the idea to reconstruct the Crystal Palace keeps coming back in the public debate in London until our times, but that's another story. And this idea to construct a building out of prefabricated elements is also another one of the most important problems of modern architecture. The balloon frame house, the lightweight, with the lightweight wooden timber structure, is another example of this strategy that's very important for American history and for the development of American cities. This is how the West was won, actually, and this is how it was populated. And it also takes us to our part of the world, and also to America, to the prefabrication, to the mass prefabrication of housing, which is often associated with this drab housing estate in Eastern Europe, but actually it's a strategy that was being used, and it's still used to our times in architecture in all sorts of for all sorts of functions, for housing, offices, retail, storage, anything. But the Crystal Palace was the first major building to give this strategy a refined form. But it took a long time. It took a few decades for architecture it took a few decades to formulate a manifesto that would bring a lot of these issues together. So the Crystal Palace was built in 1851, but it was a building without the manifesto. It was a building without it was a purely pragmatic building, And in the next decades, architecture kept on going in a certain direction. You know, there's never a clear path. But some of these strategies adopted by Paxton in the Crystal Palace were becoming more and more popular, and were adapted on a growing scale. But it took a few decades for modern architecture to become a program, to become a set of ideas. And the book, I think the most important book where all these ideas were, let's say, distilled into a manifesto, is probably Le Corbusier's book, Towards an Architecture, originally published in 1923 in French. An important thing to realize is that the original title of this book is Vers une Architecture, which means towards an architecture, not necessarily towards a new architecture, but towards a certain essence of architecture, you know. But the title of the first English translation was Towards a New Architecture, and this translation really distorts the meaning of this book and the idea behind it, because it was not Le Corbusier's intention to create a whole new architecture, but rather to build a bridge between the most let's say conscious ways of building in the past and the architecture of today. So it's not a coincidence that on the opening spread of this book you see a modern American skyscraper that Le Corbusier did not see in nature at this point of his life. It took him another 12 years to get to America, but he admired American skyscrapers nonetheless. And a Renaissance building on the other photo, because it was his, like I said, it was his idea to build a bridge between the past and the present, and to formulate a program for the future on this basis. So hence the lessons from Rome and from ancient Egypt, from ancient Greece. This is one of the most famous spreads from this book, which is as important, you know, as where the text is as important as the layout and the illustrations. He presented the ancient Greek temples as perfect machines built for a certain purpose, very logical buildings that are very rational, and that were not built for that were built as machines, and he compares them for a certain purpose, and he compares them with the first modern cars that were designed to, you know, more and more to serve a certain to perform a certain function and to perform it well. So hence the more, you know, the growing emphasis on aerodynamics and on the design that would make the cars go faster. And this comparison of a Greek temple with a modern automobile was shocking for many, but I think it communicates very well what Le Corbusier was arguing. And he was basically arguing that architects should learn from engineers, and he famously wrote that architects have eyes, but these eyes don't see. So architects they look at the world around them. The world is changing, the world is calling for new forms and for a new architecture, for another architecture, but they are still stuck in their old ways, in their old academic ways. And he was saying, look to the cars, look to the modern ocean liners, look at machines, and learn from the engineers. And he also presented the Greek temples as more of an engineering, like a creation of an engineer and not an architect. an architect understood as a specialist in ornamenting buildings. So this is also where the notion of the building as a machine for living in comes up for the first time. Le Corbusier argued that buildings should be designed with the use of the most up-to-date technology, and they should be thought of as machines or tools that are here to serve us, not something that we should accommodate to, but the building should serve us like a good piece of equipment. And very briefly, I would like to mention another important change that occurred in 19th century. In the first part, I talked about the impact of the relationship between this rapid acceleration of everything in 19th century and architecture, and the growing divide between the possibilities and the form of architecture. But another important phenomenon of this era was the growing divide between between hygiene and the consciousness of hygiene and urban growth, and the form it took in early 19th century, where the growth of cities got out of control, and cities started to develop organically into uncontrollable organisms. So this is a very typical picture from 19th century London. Boys guiding people home through the London smog, and if you read descriptions of life in 19th century London, the smog and the soot and the omnipresent smoke are they keep coming up everywhere in every possible description, every novel, and that the smog symbolized the problem. That the cities are growing, the industry is growing, it gives people jobs, it does wonders, it produces useful things, but at the same time it's killing us and it makes the cities unlivable. But at the same time there was no way to, for a long time nobody thought of a way to find a new way for cities to develop, to push the way they develop in a new direction and try to reconcile the nature and the city, health and prosperity, urban with the urban life with the rural life, and the advantages of both industry and farming. So the goal became to be able to use all the wonders of technology and to the wealth that the industry brings and the opportunities that the big city gives, with the joys of country living and the healthfulness of country living. So you have to imagine all these people. Over the decades, the educated people suddenly became aware of all the hygienic issues, of the impact that the industry has on our health, and but at the same time they couldn't do anything about it. That was just the way it was. So probably the most important manifesto for a new city that influenced the thinking of the modern city in the next century was the Garden City of Tomorrow, conceived by Sir Ebenezer Howard, who was not, just like Paxton was not an architect, he was not a planner, and he was not an architect either, but he came up with this revolutionary idea that was never fully implemented, but it inspired people all over the world, in Europe and in North America especially, to think of the city in a different way. So the idea of Howard's idea was to, let's say, cure the old cities by depopulating them, by making people, drawing people back to the countryside and building entirely new, healthy cities in the countryside that would have a size of 35,000 people. So they would be large enough to have a public life and to have some of the features that we love about big cities. But at the same time, their growth would be limited to a certain extent, and they would be surrounded with agricultural land and with nature. And the garden city would be connected by fast railways with other garden cities. So basically, Howard envisioned turning England into a network of smaller cities that would be have all the advantages of the town and all the advantages of the countryside without any disadvantages. This idea of depopulating the cities and of reducing the densities is another thing that I think that can be traced throughout urban planning. You know, the urban theory in 20th century. Here's Le Corbusier again, the man of Renaissance. You know, who had this brilliant talent of dealing with the biggest issues of modern architecture and planning in a very convincing way. So this is his idea for let's say, dealing with Paris. Paris was another city that could not cope with its growth in late 19th and early 20th century. So he basically proposed to gradually replace the old city structure, the unhealthy city structure, the super dense structure with this grid of skyscrapers connected with wide roads and surrounded with greenery, with just a few historic buildings left between them. And here's another of his vision, a contemporary city of 3 million people. This was a purely theoretical project without a particular site. Again, this idea of reducing the density, increasing greenery, of an emphasis of mass transportation, and here's where the ideas for the modern building and the modern city come together in these towers that would be constructed thanks to this modern technologies with an open plan, curtain walls, lots of light, distant views, and extremely hygienic living conditions. It was all about the modern city was all about having all these ideas for the modern city, not just Howard's and Le Corbusier's, but also other ideas that I believe Maciej will mention in his part and in his next talks, was to have the best of both worlds, of the city and the countryside, to try to let's say have the impossible, to have the leisure and the industry, the greenery and the city, the open spaces and the let's say the attraction of the big city all in one. And I will leave you with this lovely image. And if you have any questions, I'll be here.
Maybe later.
Yeah, maybe later. Yeah. So the floor is yours, Maciej.
I will be talking about American origins of modernism. And as you will see in a moment, most of my talk will be devoted to Frank Lloyd Wright, and you will see why. It is virtually impossible to pin down the exact moment when modernism as an architectural style started flourishing in the United States. Of course, we tend to think that it was fully recognized only after the Second World War, when most of the greatest European architects had already moved to America seeking refuge from the atrocities of the war-ridden old continent. Of course, we are usually being taught that modernism came to America as a refreshingly new style, as something completely different from what was happening in American architecture. But nothing more incorrect. Surprisingly enough, what we perceive to be modern in terms of architecture nowadays started emerging in America already in the 1870s. Therefore, in order to prove that modern architecture was as much American as it was European, it is necessary to take a step back all the way to the 19th century. As Carl W. Condit, a researcher on the late 19th century architectural currents, shrewdly observes, and here I quote, "Style in architecture represents or stands for those essential characteristics of construction, form, ornament, and detail that are common to all the important structures of any definable period in history. But it also stands for those technical and aesthetic qualities that grow directly and organically out of the conditions of human existence and out of the aspirations and powers of human beings," end quote. And using this line of thinking, we can easily conclude that for the most part of the 19th century, architecture was suffering from a sort of identity crisis. And up until the late 70s, none of the buildings erected on American soil were reflections of the myriad of inventions that had been conceived throughout the past decades. And both architects as well as their clients were still in love with many different revivals, let it be classical, Victorian, or Gothic. Buildings were not translating the technical advances of that period, and almost no one, in the architectural milieu was paying attention to the shifts occurring in the rapidly industrializing society. And as a result, most of the architecture was somehow amazingly out of place. And here you can see two examples from America, the Federal Hall in New York City and the Healy Hall at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. As the vast majority of architects were preoccupied by coming up with even more intricate patterns of ornamentation for their designs, it was engineers who started the real revolution. They were building bridges and railway stations using all of the technical knowledge of the times. There was a growing discrepancy between the artistic expression of an architect and the practical ways in which engineers were remodeling American landscape, especially the cities, so something that Grzegorz was talking about. The momentum came in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, when flames devoured the central part of this rapidly developing city on the shores of Lake Michigan. Of course, it was a tragedy, but from the architectural point of view, it was a blessing. As a decision was made to rebuild the city from ashes, many new safety measures were set up in the building code in order to eliminate the possibility of another great fire. New buildings were to be constructed using cast iron columns, wrought iron floor girders, with solid masonry that would be able to withstand any future cataclysm. As these new rules promised new design opportunities, many young architects and engineers came to Chicago to make their ultimate statement on how the modern city should look like. Among them was William Le Baron Jenney, famous for being the father of American skyscraper. What he did was to introduce the metal frame on a large scale. Metal frames is something that Grzegorz was talking about. And his home insurance building, this beauty, at that time was the tallest building in the world, and it was supported by a steel skeleton which allowed to erect taller and seemingly lighter constructions. Another factor that contributed to the emergence of skyscrapers was, of course, the popularization of the elevator as a common feature for the newly constructed office buildings. And suddenly, the weird eclecticism of the earlier decades was set to give up the stage for an entirely new style known as the Chicago School. The most noticeable difference between the Chicago School and the rest of American architecture of the late 19th century lays in the formal functionality of the former. Among the greatest representatives of this style we can enumerate John Wellborn Root, Daniel Burnham, Dagmar Adler, and most importantly, Louis Sullivan. The philosophy of Sullivan formed a kind of theoretical core for the entire movement. His most celebrated concept was that form follows function, something that we usually quite automatically contribute to the later generations of architects. But here, the proper understanding of the word function is crucial for understanding what Sullivan stood for. For him, functionality was not only about the structural features of the building and how it resonated the technical advancement of the times. It was much more about the aspirations of its users, their values, ideals, and spiritual needs. For him, a modern style would be a modern not of one or another form, but rather of an organic whole taking shape from the physical, intellectual, and emotional milieu in which it existed. He also thought that all types of architecture are related to feudalism and should be replaced by more democratic styles. In that sense, modern architecture was concentrated around the notion of freedom in the artistic expression of an architect. Instead of repeating what has already been done, modern architects should be able to create their own original styles. And when it comes to the stylistic features that were common among the architects of the Chicago School, probably the most characteristic one was the window, today known as the Chicago window. It consists of a large plate window with two sets of sash windows on the sides. I hope you can see that here in this picture. In a typical Chicago school building, windows are grouped to form a geometrical pattern characterized by its repetitiveness. Oftentimes, this pattern is broken by sets of windows projecting out of the facade to form bay windows. So, these here. What is also relatively common in is the resemblance of the entire structure to a Greek column. With a distinguishable base, shaft or core in the middle stories, and an ornated cornice at the top evoking the Capitol. Yet another common feature is a striking lack of ornamentation, which clearly marks a turning point in the history of architecture of the 19th century. What is probably the most iconic example of this style for me is the Carson, Pyrie Scott and Company department store at the corner of State and Madison Streets in downtown Chicago. It was designed by Louis Sullivan, and apart from the typical features that I've already discussed, we can see that the base of this building, its first two stories, are clothed in cast iron covered with a remarkably profuse, delicate, and foliate and floral ornament. Although not in accordance with the rest of the building, this base is there for a very precise reason. It had to appeal to the overwhelmingly female clientele of the store, so in a sense, it forms a perfect example of how Sullivan perceived functionality. Oddly enough, the Chicago school style faded into oblivion soon after it reached the peak of its popularity. Even though the Carson Pyrie Scott building was erected already in the 20th century, its commercial style was becoming obsolete as once again Americans turned back to classical revival as their preferred architectural style. One of the defining moments of this strange turn backwards was the 1893 Wards Columbian Exposition held in Chicago. The first grounds were designed in large part by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was famous for designing the Central Park in New York City, and Daniel Burnham, who only a few years earlier was one of the most prolific architects of the Chicago School. They decided to shift the focus from sheer functionality to the typical late 19th century understanding of beauty. The result was a grandiose design which followed the principles of Beaux-Arts school. Its buildings were neoclassical, symmetrical, and evoked a sense of nobility and splendor, and they were painted white, hence the name White City. Although it was celebrated as a stunningly beautiful example of civic architecture, many of the architects, especially Sullivan, condemned it to be utterly un-American and backwards. Nevertheless, neoclassicism dominated American architectural landscape for the next 2 decades. But fortunately, American architecture was not all about erecting countless pantheons and Gothic birthday cakes. In the vast ocean of architectural mediocrity, there was a gleaming light of hope, namely the greatest architect, American architect of all time, Frank Lloyd Wright. He started his career in the late 1880s when he worked for Adler and Sullivan, the most innovative architectural firm in Chicago at that time. At first he was a draftsman, but soon it became clear that he had greater ambitions. Sullivan was eager to make him his most cherished protege. He supported Wright both financially and spiritually, so it's not surprising that the young apprentice had many similar views on the role of architecture and architect. Just as Sullivan, Wright believed that architecture translates the values and aspirations of the society into buildings. He also believed that none of the old majorly European styles should be replicated in America, as Americans should invent their own style to express their own cultural values and to mark their independence. As Wright was full of self-admiration, already in the late 1890s, he was convinced that he would become the one true architect who will create this one truly democratic and utterly American style. And surprisingly, he was quite right about this. Although his life was extremely interesting and full of anecdotes, let's have a look at what he actually designed and why is he perceived to be the greatest American architect of all time. The first phase of his 7-year-long career started in the 1890s in Oak Park, a rich community in the western suburbs of Chicago, where he designed numerous residences for his wealthy clients and for his own family. These buildings were all designed in a very particular way, typical for Frank Lloyd Wright and his prairie style. Probably the most distinguishing feature of this style is its horizontality. We can easily see how the entire structure looks somehow flattened. The roofs are flat or hipped, which means that all of the sides of the roof are sloping gently towards the walls. There are many overhanging eaves, and eaves are the edges of the roof, so this part. And the windows are grouped to form horizontal sets. All these horizontal lines were evoking the landscape of Midwestern prairies, hence the name of the style. And as Wright was aiming at creating the very first truly American style, the extensive use of local materials is not surprising. It is interesting, though, how he also paid a lot of attention in designing the interiors of these homes. Furniture, rugs, and even tableware were meticulously fitting the whole building. Low ceilings were creating the atmosphere of serene coziness, simultaneously underlining the horizontal aspect of the structure. Fireplace was said to be the focal point of the entire household. And another distinctive feature of a typical Frank Lloyd Wright's house is the fact that its first floor is designed as an open plan, so without any permanent walls. It also marked the endless horizontality and freedom. And here you have another examples of this style, the Roby House, probably one of the most famous examples of the prairie style. And here's the interior, so we can see that the chairs, tables, everything, actually even the rug, are designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. These Oak Park houses were important for two reasons. First, they made Frank Lloyd Wright popular, and second, as was observed by Robert Fishman, and here I quote, they marked the beginning of Wright's commitment to the single-family house as the only permissible shelter for a free society, end quote. They were perfect embodiments of the kind of freedom Wright cherished the most, of individuality combined with a great sense of privacy. This is probably what forms the biggest distinction from American urban thinkers and architects such as Ebenezer Howard or Le Corbusier, for whom the spirit of community was the most important value in their utopian visions. Wright was much more into the typical American individualism, and it will be very visible in his version of urban utopia, the Broadacre City, which I will discuss later. In the 1920s, the decade of prosperity and conspicuous consumption, American architects started shifting towards their own version of modernity. They celebrated technological innovations not in structural form of their buildings, but rather in their opulent geometrical and floral ornamentation. The Art Deco style, which name is strictly related to the 1925 Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, was in the 20s and 30s was known simply as modern, modernist or modernistic. The term Art Deco was coined much later and is somehow erroneous, since it suggests that American architecture at that time was not modern at all. As Gwendolyn Wright points out, American architects of the 20s took a different path towards modernity, exploring visual perception and special effects rather than paying attention to structural honesty, typical for European modernism. Some of the best-known examples of this style include Chrysler Building in New York City, or Detroit's Guardian Building, which you can see here. But this style was most popular in smaller buildings such as theaters or concert halls. It was also a starting point for a distinctively American version of modernism known as streamline modern or zigzag modern, with curved lines and overall simplicity relating simultaneously to European modernism and American Art Deco. And although Art Deco dominated the architectural landscape of the 20s, there are some examples of dashingly modern structures, modern in the European sense of this word. And as I don't have too much time to delve into it, I will just show you two examples. The first one is Lovell's Health House from LA, designed by Austrian-American architect Richard Neutron in 1927. And it is one of the first examples of a single-family house constructed entirely on a steel skeleton. As you can see, it is deprived of any ornamentation whatsoever, what makes it extremely modern. The double-height glass wall, this one, the double-height glass wall and the terrace structure shows how the building is immersed in its surroundings, and this particular feature makes it American. Another example comes from Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Savings Fund Society building, designed by George Howe and William Liscas, opened in 1932, and it was immediately hailed as the most modern building in the US, thanks to the use of numerous brand new inventions, such as drop ceiling, vacuum tile, hermetically sealed windows, and air conditioning. It was one of the earliest examples of a typical office tower from the later decades, a landmark of what was soon to be called the international style. The term international style was coined by Henry Russell Hitchcock, Philip Johnson, and Alfred Barr Jr., curators of the famous exhibition held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 1932. Its main objective was to promote a European formally experimental version of modernism as the only viable counterbalance to inferior American architecture. Hitchcock, Johnson, and Barr concentrated on three main principles of this new better style. The first one is that it's volume rather than mass. Second, regularity without symmetry. And third, strict aversion to ornamentation. The exhibition has long been regarded as the defining point in the history of American modernism, but as you have already seen, it was not such a breakthrough, as many variations of modernism were already present in America. Moreover, the curators focused solely on the visual aspects of European modernism, completely omitting its social concerns. And for that reason, another exhibition held at MoMA only 2 years later seems to be far more influential. The 1934 exhibition on European public housing, curated by Catherine Bauer, showcased various housing projects, especially from Germany, emphasizing their functionality and particular attention to the needs of the poor city dwellers. And here you have one example of such housing project from Frankfurt in Germany, the zigzag houses by Ernst May. It was important for many reasons, mainly because it was the first time when the subject of public housing was addressed in the United States in a serious and organized way. The other reason that marks the importance of this exhibition is that the Federal Housing Administration was established in the same year. This government agency was crucial in the later developments of public housing across America. It will be the main subject of my next lecture in November, so I will not talk extensively on this subject today. I'll just show you two examples of the earliest public housing projects from New York City. The first one is Williamsburg houses. It was built for white residents. And the second one, Harlem River houses, built for African Americans in Harlem, in Manhattan. And of course, public housing was segregated back in the 30s. But public housing was not the only problem that defined American architecture of the 30s. Of course, this decade was influenced by the Great Depression. It can be seen in the sudden departure from the highly ornamented Art Deco of the 20s and a shift towards a much more tame style of streamlined modern. The New Deal programs such as Public Works Administration or Works Progress Administration completely transformed the outdated infrastructure, providing work for American architects and engineers, of whom 90% were unemployed at the beginning of the 30s. Numerous projects such as schools, fire stations, city halls, dams, bridges, etc. were erected during that period. Most of them were designed in a style known as PWA modern, or Depression modern, or strict classicism. It is similar to the streamlined modern, but it is much more geometrical, evoking classical architecture with a touch of novelty in its zigzag ornamentation. But not only this federally funded architecture flourished in the 30s, it was also a time when the one and only Frank Lloyd Wright entered the second fruitful phase of his career. Of course, his best-known project was the house for Edgar Kaufman, a wealthy businessman from Philadelphia. Falling Water, because that's the name of the estate, is hailed as the best work of Wright and the best all-time work of American architecture according to the American Institute of Architects. The building sits on the rock, directly overhanging a small waterfall with 3 terraced stories. Once again, it shows deep connection to the surroundings as well as horizontality typical for Wright's earlier designs. It was also the first time when Wright used reinforced concrete as the main building material. But in the 30s, Wright designed not only for the wealthy. Starting in 1936, he designed around 60 houses for middle-income families. These structures are known as Usonian houses, and the term Usonia, of course, is a reference to the United States. They were relatively small, single-story L-shaped dwellings with flat roofs, big windows overlooking the garden, and carports. Wright's invention consisting of overhang shelter for cars, so just a cheaper version of a garage. While designing these houses, Wright also shifted the central place of the household from the fireplace to the kitchen. Although they are not as impressive as Falling Water or Prairie houses, they proved highly influential to American single-family housing, as they are perceived to be the protoplast of the ranch style common in the 1950s suburbia. And another example, which you've already seen today, another example of Frank Lloyd Wright's work from the 30s is the Johnson Wax Administration Building from Racine, Wisconsin. This odd-looking office building is in effect a masterpiece of the use of natural light. There are virtually no windows on the facade, but the entire roof of the main working area, also known as the Great Workroom, is made of specifically designed plexiglass. It is supported by concrete dendriform hollow columns, slender at the bottom with cylindrical lily pads at the top. But the most daring Wright's idea from that time was his vision of a utopian city, conceived in reaction to Corbusian Reagan City. The Broadacre city is actually a complete negation of the city as we know it. It marks the highlight of Wright's philosophy, where individuality is the most important value leading to democracy and freedom. And in Broadacre, this freedom was strictly connected to the land ownership. In his scheme, each family would be given a 1-acre plot of land. As he regarded a single-family house as the ultimate expression of American democracy, he made this 1-acre family units the central structure of the entire community. Of course, some factories, schools, office and apartment buildings, and community centers were present in this plan, but they were far less important. The land developed in such way was based on individuality, supported by the technical advances of the 20th century, mainly the car. The car which contributed to the very shape of this design. The dependency on car allowed to connect various points of the city within short periods of time. Of course, this vision was much more complicated, but since I don't have too much time to discuss it, I will use Robert Fishman's words to sum up the entire idea. And here I quote, "Broadacre City was a juxtaposition of the past and the future, the ideal of Jeffersonian democracy given new meaning in terms of art technology of the future, end quote. And combined with the design of the Usonian house, it can be argued that Frank Lloyd Wright was the crucial figure in the suburbanization that came into fruition in the later decade. Such a car-dependent vision of the future of America was also the main subject of the tremendously successful 1939 New York City World's Fair and its Futurama Pavilion, sponsored by General Motors. Inside, the visitors could admire a 36,000 square foot model representing the American landscape of the 60s, with modern houses, visionary cities, dams, and rolling hills. All of that crisscrossed by a network of highways allowing to drive as fast as 100 miles per hour. As in Wright's Broadacre City, here as well, car was the biggest inspiration for modernity. And to sum up, I think that saying that modernism was a purely European invention that arrived to the United States only in the 30s is a huge overstatement. First of all, there were many utterly modern buildings and ideas that emerged in America already in the late 19th century, all of them centered around specifically American issues and traditions. Second of all, the early stages of American modernism were very fragmented, yet it seems rather absurd to say that they were non-existent. The quest for a purely American style resulted in the emergence of various indigenous visions of modernity. Finally, America had its own visionary architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, whose works can be easily compared to those of Le Corbusier, Howard, or Walter Gropius. If we place Frank Lloyd Wright as the American counterpart of these European thinkers, we get the most significant difference between American and European modernism. Whereas for Howard and Le Corbusier, cooperation and community was the key to success, for Wright it was individuality. Whereas Europeans were much more focused on the needs of urban masses, Wright concentrated on the needs of upper and middle classes, creating a model for the society based on a single-family housing. In that sense, we can argue that Wright, as the epitome of American modernism, introduced massive suburbanization, a purely American form of architecture and urban planning. So, I think that now, hopefully, it is clear that modernism was as much American as it was European. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, we are happy to answer them. Any questions? No?
I have a question, which has to do with the sort of geographical placing of modernist buildings in the United States. Because I was wondering, you showed us lots of, we had all the East Coast representation with the Chicago School Right and New York buildings and so on, and I noticed there was something from Wisconsin and also from California. And I was wondering whether there have been any kind of modernist presence in the South or in the North.
Of course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Modernism was dispersed throughout America. Of course, these examples I've shown you today are the most defining examples, especially Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings or the skyscrapers. But for instance, in Miami, Florida, there is a huge district full of beautiful examples of streamlined modern and Art Deco buildings. The same goes with California, where we can find a lot of examples of Richard Mitra houses, which are extremely modern. So yes, and for instance, in New Mexico and Texas, modernism was much more focused on underlining the importance of regional influences. So it's more, let's say, Hispanic, but still it exists, yeah.
But it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of states that are not, like, it's not the South I was thinking about, like, the old, the South understood as, Alabama and Georgia and so on and so on. So because that would be sort of a test of how, how American it is in a sense, or because it seems to me that this is the region of the United States that sort of opposed any kind of changes throughout history. So I was wondering whether it was reflected in architecture as well.
As far as I know, in the southern states, such as Alabama or Mississippi, it was not as popular. But during the New Deal era in the 1930s, when the PWA was the most popular style throughout the country, a lot of buildings were built that represented this modernism, stylistic modernism. And for instance, one of the biggest projects from the New Deal era, from the PWA architecture, was the Tennessee Valley Authority, yes, built in Tennessee. And it consisted of a set of dams, water dams, with a lot of small housing projects for the workers. And it was extremely modern, even in the European sense of this word.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions?
So I have a question. So what happened with this idea of broad-acre city? I mean, how did it click?
Fortunately, nothing happened with it. Because it was, for me, it's one of the most authoritarian and even tyrannical ideas of 20th century urban planning. We can see some aspects of it in the suburbanization that came to America in the 50s, but in general it was just a purely theoretical idea of how Wright imagined the perfect world for him, actually, because he put himself as the center mastermind of this entire scheme. So, yeah. Anyone else? No? Okay. So thank you very much for coming here today and for listening to us. I hope it was interesting for you. And in 2 weeks, Grzegorz will be talking about Grzegorz will be talking about how European tourists and architects perceived New York City in the 30s. So, yeah, thank you very much. Goodbye.